Welcome, Tony, to BeyondPhrenology. So for the viewers, Tony is a distinguished professor of philosophy and psychology at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio. And he's also the author of one of the most famous books in ecological psychology called the Radical Embodied Cognitive Science. And let's start from there. Tony, why Radical Embodied Cognitive Science? Starts with radical.
Well, so that name. Hi, everyone. By the way, that name is from Andy Clark. He basically defined this view that Andy. This is one of the things that Andy likes about me, I think, is that I'm more extreme than he is. So he can say, "Look, I'm just doing regular stuff. Tony's the weirdo." But so he defined this view, right, called radical embodied cognition, actually. To kind of point out what he was disagreeing with. And the main thing that he was disagreeing with is the replacement of representational and computational cognitive science with nonlinear dynamical cognitive science. And that's what I argued in favor of, crediting Andy with the name as I went along. So I've always been skeptical of the idea that human cognition is at its base computational and representational. It doesn't mean that we aren't capable of representing things or doing computation, but most of what we do is not representing the environment or computing anything. So that's the radical part.
I see. And the embodied part?
The embodied part. So I feel like embodiment is the wrong name for this discipline of cognitive science, because it's not so much about like meat, right? It's about that kind of close connection between how you move and how you experience, and about your kind of enmeshment. Enmeshment, is that a word? It is. I just made it up. Enmeshment in like a social cultural setting, and that kind of tight connection between how you move and what you experience and the kind of complexity of the physical and cultural environment around you is what does most of the explanatory work in cognitive science. And that's what I mean by embodiment. I don't mean, being made of meat or anything like that. Although, we are made of meat and that does matter, but that's not mainly what it's about. It's not so much about the meat, but it's about the phenomenology and the enmeshment in a complex environment. I'm just going to keep using that word that I made up, enmeshment.
It's a nice sounding word. So Tony, were you always a proponent of radical and embodied approaches to cognition, or given your couple of decades of career as a philosopher and psychologist, did something happen, kind of a eureka or an epiphany at some point?
When I was, as an undergraduate, I studied philosophy as an undergraduate. I studied with Daniel Dennett and, kind of worshiped Daniel Dennett. And he has a kind of moderate skepticism of representational cognitive science that I inherited from him. And then when I went to graduate school, I started reading Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and things like that. And in reading those, I went from being kind of moderate skeptic that I inherited from Dennett to wondering why people thought, to begin with, that our minds are representations of an external world. And of course, at the same time, I was reading Richard Rorty and other people like that. And also reading, this is early on in grad school, Randy Beer and Rodney Brooks and Tim Van Gelder, who was one of my professors as well. Right. And so, combine the Heidegger and then the robotics I was reading is what kind of made me skeptical of representations. I don't think when I first started being skeptical of representations in computational cognitive science, though Andy hadn't yet coined the term radical embodied cognitive science or radical embodied cognition. And I eventually became interested in James Gibson because James Gibson's work provides a way to kind of take the phenomenological views of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and put them in contact with scientific data in a way that is very difficult to do in general. And right, the idea in the book Radical Embodied Cognitive Science is that, look, there are all these cool models that people are building, but we need a theory, a scientific theory, to actually explain them. And that's what ecological psychology, in my view, provides.
And there's something beyond ecological psychology, or like where are we with respect to Gibson or the post-Gibsonian era?
So in my research group here in Cincinnati, we just refer to him as Saint Jimmy, who is like the leader of our, the patron saint of our sect. So I don't think we are post Gibson. The field developed quickly after Gibson died, especially with the work of Mike Turvey, who just died, unfortunately. Good friend of mine, Scott Kelso, and others basically said, okay, how do we explain actual behavior from an ecological psychology point of view? Oh, let's bring in this nonlinear dynamics. And bringing in the nonlinear dynamics has kind of made ecological psychology, Gibson's views, into a different kind of science, but one that still respected the kind of core of Gibson's view, which is that perception is direct, and that we don't have a homunculus in us directing our behavior, and that the environment is actually extraordinarily rich with information, especially for a creature that moves. And these are pretty abstract ideas. And, Turvey's work, especially Turvey, made them into a real science in a way that I'm not saying that Gibson himself wasn't a scientist, of course, but the idea that it could be such an expansive research program comes from combining Gibson's direct perception and environmental richness ideas with the kind of Mike Turvey et al. Dynamical systems theory movement.
Yeah. So what is unique, what I see about the representational approach versus the more ecological and embodied approaches is looking at careers of people. I see people starting from a very ecological inactive kind of mindset or computational. I rarely see example, and correct me if I'm wrong, of people who started with computational and representational at some point in life, they convert. So this kind of religious transformation, I don't see, right? So are these two different approaches kind of reflect how we generally think or constrained to think about the brain? Because,
that's good.
Yeah.
It is a lot like a religion, I suppose. All scientific theories. One thing you learn from Thomas Kuhn is that being a member of a scientific community is a lot like participating in a religion. But I know of at least two conversion experiences. One is, a long time ago, Ulrich Neisser, who was one of the founders of cognitive psychology. This is according to Eleanor Gibson's autobiography, reported waking up in the middle of the night and saying, what if Jimmy's right? And became a kind of a proponent, at least partially, of the ecological approach. Another one is a good friend of mine, Mike Anderson, who went from an embodied computationalist view to a pretty radical anti-representationalist view in the 2010.
And do you also know of some converts the other way around?
So one of the ways in which people convert is that they say, look, I studied ecological psychology, but I feel like it's by being kind of religiously anti-mental representation, I am giving up too many explanatory tools. And I feel like maybe Ramesh Balasubramaniam is one of the people who made that transition. I remember one of my, someone who hasn't made the transition, but I remember one of my first kind of co-authored things with Michael Richardson. Mike said, I'm not afraid of using the R word. And this is a paper with Mike Anderson, me, and Mike Richardson, one of my favorite papers that I've been on, actually, where Mike Anderson and I both were just like, no, we don't want to use the R word. We're not going to force you to. So I think that what happens is at a certain point, you start wondering what are the things that you can't explain within your paradigm, right? Within your scientific approach. And I think for ecological psychology, it's been the kind of languagey things that humans are quite good at, that are hard to explain. And from the computational point of view, it's the moving around things that humans and other animals are quite good at that are hard to explain. Yeah. So I think, just like as you get older, maybe you're more likely to put a little milk in your coffee. I think as you get older as a scientist, you're more likely to be open to ideas from other disciplines. I do think that humans do represent things, right? I just don't think that that's the foundation of all of our mental lives. Right now I'm thinking about my grandmother, who's been, dead for 20 years now. And I can't imagine how it would do that other than by, in some way, representing her.
Yeah. So how do you argue with someone who says like representation, or let's not go to representation. Computation is the only game in town, the Fodor kind of argument. If it's not, so yeah, you have the book and we have the idea of information being in the environment or richness of the information, but that is not a direct refutation of computation happening in the brain, right? As a sole premise. Do we have empirical evidence of computation not happening? I mean, I understand, science doesn't work that way, but still, if not computation, then what? Playing devil's advocate here.
Right. That's the Fodor question, right? The only game in town is the way he put it. But I think that what we have really are a series of tools that we can use to explain the phenomena that we observe. And sometimes the computational tools are really valuable, and other times they're not. And I think that, so I don't have an argument against a scientific approach. I don't think you could have a kind of philosophical argument against a scientific approach, or you couldn't have one that anyone would believe at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are places where, when you look at some phenomena of interest, the tools that you need to use to account for it are not computational. And I think the easiest place to make that case is in kind of gross bodily movements and motor control. And Andy Clark, who does believe in representations at the foundation of cognitive science, talked about how the way to understand humans is that they're bad at logic but good at frisbee, right? The frisbee part of our lives, the thing require kind of fine motor control and moving our body in subtle ways. Computation gets very little grip in there. And in contrast, at the same time, dynamics gets very little grip in how am I thinking about my grandmother now?
That's right. Although I would say that the computational motor neuroscience folks might disagree.
They would, yeah, and that's an active debate in motor control in neuroscience.
Yes. So why do you think that these two approaches, for example, thinking of your grandmother, we still do not have dynamical systems explanations or tools to study these kind of cognitive phenomena, and at the same time, the other way around, we do not have proper computational approaches as well. I mean, there are definitely a lot of loopholes, in fact, at every level of explanation.
Right. So the easy answer, Colin Allen, a philosopher of cognitive science, has accused me of being a lazy pragmatist for liking this easy answer, which is that, no scientific theory is going to explain everything about us. We are very complicated. So that's the easy answer. The harder answer is, okay, so there's this idea that some postmodernist thinkers have, where they say that the way to evaluate a theory is by seeing how it performs on the cases that it wasn't designed to work on. Right. So you could criticize the computational approach by saying, oh, it doesn't help me explain how we play Frisbee. You could criticize the dynamical approach by saying, oh, it doesn't help me explain how I remember my grandmother. But I think that's not the way to do things. I think that what you have to do is you have to kind of start, every theory has to start in the positions of strength and the things that it explains well. And then from there, like fight like hell to advance to the areas that are harder for you to explain. So for example, although I don't endorse it fully, I feel like Ezekiel de Paula, Elena Kafari, and Hannah de Jager's book, Linguistic Bodies, is a pretty good attempt to explain how humans do the linguistic things that we're capable of without starting with the foundation of representation and computation. Right. And I think, these people's work better than I do, but I think that in the kind of computational end of motor control, there are people who are taking tools that weren't really designed to make sense of how I catch a Frisbee or how I don't fall over when I'm standing here, and adapting them. So I think there's progress being made in both directions. Really, the reason I planted a flag the way I did in that book is that I just was seeing too many people like dismissing dynamical cognitive science out of hand, as if it couldn't possibly explain any cognition, because it has explained lots of cognition, right? As have computational approaches. But very few people argue, like, as a matter of some philosophical principle, that computation could never do any explanatory work in the cognitive sciences. You don't see that argument, but you do see the other one. Right? You do see the argument against the dynamical approaches, and that's why I wrote that book the way that I did.
So it was more like creating a room for dynamical approach rather than disparaging the computational approach.
That's right. Again, I guess because I'm teaching it this week, I'm thinking about Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn argued that you don't really even understand a scientific approach if you don't believe it. Right. So I think that when, and I'm sure you deal with this all the time, like when you get these referee reports on your papers from people who bring up things as obvious errors that you have ready explanations for, it's because they don't start from the same starting point as you.
Yeah.
And I think that, the arguments against whichever view from people outside that view are never going to convince the people there. So it's, I guess, I don't think you have to make space, this long thing I'm saying now, because I don't think you have to make space for your view by arguing that other views are bad. You make space for your view by arguing that your view is good.
Yeah, right. But at the same time, okay, so let's go a little back. Do you think that these two approaches can coexist ad infinitum? One has to be correct and one has to be wrong, right? In the sense of, if there is some ground truth about how the brain works.
I think probably they're both wrong.
One might be less wrong than the other.
But I think, I hope that 25 years from now won't be talking about either of them. But that's how science works, right? That is, ideas have lifespans and they produce some good explanations for a time, and then people start to come up with different ideas about how to explain those things. And again, like I said, I think that right now, dynamical cognitive science is a good way to go, as is computational cognitive science. I'm more of a fan of the former than the latter, primarily for philosophical reasons that have to do with my basically commitments about the nature of our experience from phenomenologists. But I think they're both perfectly viable ways to try to do cognitive science in 2023. I hope that they're not seen as viable ways to do cognitive science in 2050. Right? I mean, I hope that the field improves and starts looking in different directions in the next few decades. I'm 54 years old. I hope to live to see the field change really dramatically.
So let's talk about neuroscience in general. So a lot of neuroscience, as we discussed in the last podcast with Vicente, a lot of it is molecular systems neuroscience, most related to physiology, with a lot of clinical applications. And a lot of cognitive neuroscience is where you make these interpretations and stories and approaches. It's more prone to approaches when you're talking about cognition than you're talking about simple molecular interactions or cellular interactions in the brain. So if it is just about the explanation, do we even need cognitive science? I mean, how does it change our life or leads to anything useful? If it's so time sensitive and it might change, and the explanation, the explanatory value itself will change, then what are we doing as an exercise to have this field called computational neuroscience or computational psychology?
Well, I mean, we're doing what scientists do, I guess, right? I mean, I guess so. I want to go back to the first point you made first about it really is true that most neuroscientists don't care about the kind of debates that we're having. They focus on physiology and neurotransmitters and gene expression and so on. Right? They don't care about these kind of whether this instantiates a computation or not. So that's not really a concern for most of neuroscience, I think, and those neuroscientists I know at least. That said, I think that science is just something that people do. It's a human activity that oftentimes has societal benefits, not always. And, the fact that the views that we have now won't be held to be correct in, the 22nd century, it doesn't mean that we should stop doing science, right? I mean, I think the only way to find out why our views we have now are ultimately incorrect is to keep pushing at them and see where they start to systematically fail. And again, the question becomes what are the things that computational cognitive science will never be able to explain, and what are the things that dynamical cognitive science will never be able to explain? And what's the thing that explains the things that they leave out, and hopefully accounts for a lot of the findings of both of the prior views. I've been teaching Thomas Kuhn this week, so I'm saying all these Thomas Kuhn things.
And there can be some things which both of them fail to explain, as well as both of them can explain simultaneously. So what should we do in those cases?
Well, I mean, I guess the thing that we ought to think about is what we gain from thinking about things in particular ways, especially when you have multiple explanations. And I feel like basically at any point in time in science, you're going to have multiple theories that are competing to explain similar phenomena. And people have traditionally used aesthetic criteria to decide, right? So this is a simpler set of explanatory tools. Let's use those, for example. But I think we can also use ethical criteria, right? So what view of, since both theories explain this phenomena in some detail and well, what which of those explanations is simpler, gives us a better understanding of humans, gives us maybe a more kind understanding of humans, leads to societal improvements. I mean, this is the thing that people tend to forget about in the sciences, is that, scientific theories are not very long lived across the board. Most of them aren't. And almost always there are options to believe other theories. And when you have a theory that makes you believe, for example, that women are biologically determined to be bad at math in comparison to men, you should rethink why you believe that, right? Because that's not I feel like that's a very unkind view of humans and leads to societal ills. And I think that, the kind of considerations that we bring when deciding what scientific theory to believe should also include things like that, like ethical or political considerations. And I actually do think that the dynamical approach gives us a better, morally, politically better view of humans and their place in nature.
Could you provide an example there?
An example, sure. So if your thinking is computation happening in your brain, I don't really know that you have any of it. As far as I'm concerned, you might not really be thinking. You might just be something that moves around as if it thinks, because I can't see your computation.
Yeah.
So I can't see that you even have a mind, for example. On the flip of that, if you look at some of the work in like social coordination dynamics, the idea that I could be responding subtly and in real time with your bodily movements, and I'm thinking here of work by Alex Paxton and Drew Abney, among others, with Rick Dale and Chris Kello, about how people's bodily movements align in ways that they're not aware of and that enable conversations. That very ability that we have, and explained that way, explained in the Paxton, Abney, Dale, Kello way, doesn't make it so that it's impossible that I don't know that you have experiences, right? Yeah. It's just kind of a necessary part of the explanation. And I know it not even in a way that I could say to you, I know it with my bodily motions. Yeah. So that other people have minds, all the other people have minds, is built into our basic embodied interaction with them and with the world, not something I have to infer based on behavior. Right. So that's an example. I've just written a book about this. That's why
fascinating perspective. So does it also bring, for example, other animals? Does the dynamic systems approach also bring other animals to the same level compared to, for example, humans are made special, and rest of the animals are for basically human consumption?
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, the idea is that this kind of dynamical approach makes us deeply connected with the world and with other living things in it, including people, but also including pets and other animals. And the idea that that humans are somehow superior to frogs just a way of saying there are things that humans do really well that frogs can't do, but we suck at catching flies with our tongues, right? Yeah. So there are things that frogs are much better at than us. And if that's from a frog's point of view, like, we have pathetic tongues.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess I think that the idea of humans and human minds being separate from the world is a mistake. I think if we can avoid it, we definitely should. And I think that we can avoid it. I think that by adopting a more ecological or even an active cognitive science point of view, you kind of make us including our minds of the world, like not right. separate from the world. So again, I think yeah. Philosophically and politically and morally, that's just a better approach.
So since you are a professor of philosophy as well, do you think the dynamical systems approach aligns a little more with the Eastern versus Western religious traditions?
Um,
At
so
the more meta level, I mean, not in the details, but in terms of an overall, the aura which it creates in terms of your thinking.
yeah, so I mean, Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, Eleanor Rosh wrote that great book in the 1991, The Embodied Mind, where they align the kind of embodied cognitive sciences with a flavor of Buddhism. And I think there's something to that. I do think that the idea, I do think the idea of the computational approach is very much a kind of Western religious tradition idea, right? Your cognitive system, that's a computer program running on your brain, is just a replacement for a soul, right? And the idea that we are deeply enmeshed with the environment, and not in any way separate from the world, I think that resonates, again, to the extent that I understand them, with the Buddhist tradition and other Eastern religions. But again, I am no expert there.
Right. And do you also see a link between urbanization or westernization and the interest in studying and figuring out what the brain is across cultures, or at least more awareness?
Yeah, so I mean, neuroscience is really cool. I'm not going to, but I think that if you study the brain thinking what you're doing is studying the person, then you're making a mistake, right? So I think that the kind of Western religion view, which you see in Descartes and the whole modern tradition, really, is easily just replaced with the not quite material software, because software is a weird ontological status. The not quite material software running on your brain is equivalent to the soul. So I think the kind of Westernization of the Western influence, especially in the sciences across the world, but not just in the sciences, makes people more likely to be inclined. I'm psychoanalyzing the whole world right now. So understand that I'm bullshitting. Makes people perhaps more inclined to focus on the software running on your brain, because it's a replacement for the soul.
Right.
The Judeo-Christian idea of a soul.
Right. But at the same time, again, coming back to some of the criticism of the computational approach, the idea that the software can be running in that hardware, while the hardware itself is changing all the time, whether you're looking at development, whether you're looking at aging, people have Parkinson's, and a lot of aspects of cognition remain intact, while the brain is a lot of tissues is denaturing over time, right? And similar things are happening at the day-to-day level, with respect to metabolism and things like that. So why do you think that kind of inconsistencies in explanation is still not like a red herring in the belief system?
Right. I mean, the thinking of the brain as a kind of computer, is a very, very strong reason to think that neural structure is more or less fully innate. Because if the compiler doesn't work the way the software is expecting, it won't compile and run. So there has to be structures, and so I think that the idea that the brain is a kind of computer comes with this innateness idea, for one. But for another, and you see this in like the early artificial neural network research, where people said, okay, so here's training. Now it's not learning anymore, not changing, and let's see how it performs. But that's just not in any way true of any biological thing, right? It's constantly in flux and constantly changing. So this distinction between learning and performance isn't maintainable. Neither is the distinction between development and performance, right? So, and again, I think that thinking of your mind as a kind of software that runs on your brain makes it so that it's natural to think about, well, there's development and then there's when I have a mind, or there's learning, and then there's when I'm able to think.
Right.
And I feel like I feel like that's an error. I don't know if I answered your question, but I did say things.
No, no, of course, of course. I mean, you did speak to the question. And then, so what are metaphors do we have? So, for example, let's take the dynamical systems approach. One of the criticism which often comes is it's not an explanation, it's a description of behavior. Because by the very name dynamics, you have to track the dynamics, whether you're looking at the brain, whether neural tissue, or you're looking at behavior or any physiological signal. And all you're doing, describing the dynamics in time, no matter what kind of approach you're taking. And it does not have any explanatory power. So how do we counter that?
So when I wrote that book, the Radical Embodied Cognitive Science, I kind of underestimated the popularity of this view that you just expressed. That is that really you need a mechanism to explain anything.
Yes.
And dynamics can't explain anything because it doesn't identify a mechanism. But I think that that's not true. And I think that we can get a lot more out of dynamics than just a redescription of the data, right? Because for one thing, when you look at the kind of original work in nonlinear dynamics in the cognitive sciences, it comes from a place that says, okay, cognitive systems, human bodies and brains and are far from equilibrium dynamic systems. That means we expect them to have certain properties. That leads us to some predictions that we can make and then test to see if they come through.
Right.
So there's one kind of good scientific work that you can do without talking about the mechanism by which it works, is by saying, look, far from equilibrium systems work this way. Humans are far from equilibrium systems. Let's see if this thing is true of them. Another thing you can do is you can lump and separate things based on their dynamical properties. So certain kinds of things, far from equilibrium things, among others, will have a particular kind of dynamic signature. And this is work that Damien does, along with a lot of other people, have a certain kind of dynamical signature. Other kinds of things have a different kind of dynamical signature, right? So we can do the kind of work that science does. We can really do all of the work that science does, other than describing a mechanism. And there are plenty of people who do dynamical cognitive science that do describe mechanisms. Like the people who do artificial neural networks that consider themselves dynamics people, like Randy Beer, again, one of my science heroes. Randy thinks that what he's doing is describing a candidate neural mechanism when he makes his models of object avoidance and things like that, right? Of aperture crossing.
Yes.
He thinks he's describing a potential mechanism by looking at the neural dynamics. So the idea that dynamics can't provide a mechanism is a mistake, and as is the idea that only a mechanism can do scientific explanatory work.
Right. But as a philosopher, do you think that mechanisms are there and are tractable when we are talking about a cognitive system?
So not many things in nature are linear. And the ones that have kind of linear beginnings and ends are much more likely to be subject to mechanistic style explanation. This thing happens, which causes this thing to happen, which causes this thing to happen, and then then you reach whatever output you wanted. Now, I don't think that many things in cognitive systems, many things in our minds, in our experiences, in our perceptions, work that way, where you have a clear kind of string of events, one after the other, that are causally related. Now, in philosophy of science, the idea of mechanism has morphed over the last decade or so, especially with the work of William Bechtel. What Bill has basically is that it says, look, in biology, an explanation is a mechanism. But what I mean by mechanism is going to stretch with the science. So lots of things that classically wouldn't be considered to be the identification of a mechanism. People like Bechtel have said, no, this is just a nonlinear mechanism or a circular mechanism or. So the idea still is that an explanation in the biological sciences and the life sciences has to be mechanistic. That is a view that some philosophers hold. Interestingly, veering away from there, it's a pretty natural conclusion to draw when you say, okay, the explanation is the mechanism, how, this molecule connects to that, fills that slot in the protein, and that changes the gene action in this way. When you're talking that way, you have no use for the idea of computation or representation. Right? If that's the real explanation, why do we need to then also say, oh, and by the way, that set of activities represents something?
Yeah.
So I think that that's Bechtel does not draw that conclusion, but I mean it's a pretty natural conclusion to draw. I think if the real explanation is the mechanism, then what's the computation talk doing?
Oh, that's new to me, and it seems pretty logical. I mean, in that case, the representational or computational explanations are incompatible with the mechanistic explanations, right?
Well, they're compatible, maybe, but they seem unnecessary.
Yeah.
Right. If I think real explanations are mechanistic explanations, and I have one, then there's no, nothing in a mechanism is a computation, and nothing in a mechanistic explanation is a representation of something, right? So you could say, look, we just don't need, don't need to bring in this extra explanatory layer. And as I was saying earlier, if we like simpler scientific theories, we can do without that part of it.
But as soon as we target mechanisms, then we have to go inside the skull or inside the nervous system, right? Or can we do mechanisms even from the outside?
So again, when people like Bill Bechtel, one of my favorite philosophers with whom I agree about nothing, when someone like Bechtel says, by mechanism, I don't mean, A causes B causes C causes D. I mean something much richer and much more in line with complex systems theory. Then you get mechanisms that can span scales and can include biological and non-biological things. But I think that's not the classical mechanistic view. The classical mechanistic view is going to be to talk about the way, this neurotransmitter fits into that slot in the neuron.
Right. Right. No, all this has like pretty deep, from a very career standpoint as well, of especially someone who's just starting, like myself. They have deep implications of how you shape your approach to science, and how you navigate the whole sociological landscape of getting your science funded, or like create a room for yourself.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's interesting, right, that there has to be a space, a relatively unfilled space, so that you can get funding and publications and stuff to have a career in science.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if you want to have an interesting career in science, you don't want to be the guy doing the 11th variation on the 3rd variation of something interesting.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
But there are plenty of people who have successful careers doing that. I wouldn't want to be that person.
Exactly. So why do you think, but still, when you look at the whole the sociological landscape of science, uh, the so-called mechanistic neuroscience assumes a very high status, right? Whether you're talking about institutional prestige, the salary structures, the amount of available funding for your work, and the program and the journals in which you publish, almost everything related to the scientific enterprise. Certain kind of science enjoys a much higher status compared to other, which a lot of times has to scramble for resources just to exist.
Right.
So why do you think that's the case?
So let me just start by saying, kids,
Yeah.
don't believe the things Tony believes. It makes everything harder.
Yeah.
But I think that the kind of smug answer to that is that, these neuroimaging papers produce things that look really good in the New York Times science section, right? And they give a kind of illusion of having understood something because, look, that's where the red bit is and that's where the green blob is, right? So they give a kind of illusion of understanding something in a deep way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, so far certainly, that kind of basically reductionist science, where we're looking for small scale mechanisms to explain human behavior, human action, human health, has actually produced some results that have led people to be healthier. Drug development, for example, focuses on the properties of biological activity in your body that make it so that some molecule that we create in the lab could fill the role of something in your body, or replace something in your body, or enhance the activity of something in your body. So the kind of reductionist approach so far has been better for medicine and human health. It's also been really good. It's also been really good for technology creation, I think. But I think, I guess what I deep down think is that when you explain how neurons work, you're not explaining how people work.
Right.
And I think I'm not opposed in any way to this kind of science. I think it's great. And I think there are good examples of it and bad examples of it, like everything else. And I think there's good reason that we have kind of followed this reductionist path the way that the majority of biological scientists at least have. And again, if you want funds, you want to do something that has potential like medical benefits or something like that. And I think that there's a pretty easy path. Also, as far as prestige, if you are studying neurotransmitters, you probably work in a med school and make twice as much money as me, right? So that, it really is that if you want a successful career in science, capital C, capital S, career in science, the kind of views that I've been blathering about for the last hour are not the ticket, right? The funding goes to things that are potentially medically useful, and right now that seems to be looking at little tiny things and how they interact with one another.
Right. But is it possible to use or examples, use same kind of tools, for example, a lot of imaging, but have your explanations and your designs grounded in the dynamical systems framework?
Yeah, people do, of course. Think about the whole group that Scott Kelso has built at Florida Atlantic University, right? People there do neuroimaging all the time, but they use a dynamic approach to make sense of it. And by the way, the dynamic approach isn't the problem, right? With the career in science, it's what you're studying. And right now, there's just the prestige is on biology, brains, cells, and so on, especially brains right now.
Yeah.
and you can explain them however you want, but as long as you're studying primarily brains, you're going to do better than someone who wants to study motor control or postural sway or something like that.
Right. Even though postural sway, like understanding or restoring posture has much larger implications, I would say, than studying brain in any bit in terms of health.
I agree 100%, but we're definitely in a minority here. I think people don't realize how central gait and sway are to analyzing someone's health and well-being.
Exactly.
But so I think one of my friends, a philosopher of science, Michael Silberstein, likes to talk about the fact that, well, he likes to ask people like, well, so how many diseases were cured by the Human Genome Project? Oh, right, none. Right? Maybe this kind of reductionist science is running up to its limits.
Yeah.
And maybe it's time to start looking at posture and sway and motor control as a way to assess health. And if you maybe intervening on people's postural sway and people's movement will actually help them more than intervening at their neurotransmitters.
Right. I mean, posture and sway and gait patterns are some of the earliest manifestations of any kind of motor disorders or neurodegeneration or age, for example, right? And what is ironic is that when you are studying neuroscience and fMRI, the first thing you do is to remove any posture, any gait, and all you know is something which is devoid of any of those precursors to healthy functioning.
That's right. And I mean, the technology is getting better, of course. We do have mobile EEG that is actually really effective now.
Yeah.
And soon we'll be able to, I suspect, have people moving around and look in detail about the time scale of neural activity in a way that in a way that's difficult right now.
Right.
You should never underestimate what engineers are going to figure out.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So, hopefully, again, in the next several years, we'll be able to study neural activity in great detail and postural behavior in great detail simultaneously.
Right. I mean, we have already started. For example, our group is right now using FNERs, while walking. So things have gone to that level. Of course, resolution is not that high, but still, it's getting in that direction. But coming to that point, as a philosopher, how do you see technology constraining in terms of how we think and how it shapes the whole enterprise of cognitive sciences? We can start with Skinner, for example, when it was very easy to build those Canadian boxes for pecking and the livers for the rats.
So I mean, one of the things in Tony's view about humans is that we're really good at adapting to technology, right? And right now, everyone is all up in arms about AI, right? And it won't be long before humans just accept it as part of our everyday life and have adapted to it. I predict. I think it will likely have some really awful economic consequences, but the idea that humans are going to be always freaked out by ChatGPT that's silly, right? No one's freaked out by smartphones anymore.
Yeah. In fact, you have an article in Nature Human Behavior I read a couple of days back.
Yes, I do. Yeah, that's with Spike Lee, not the movie maker Spike Lee, and Lorenzo Cicutti, where we basically it's an opinion piece where we argue that the data that people have that supposedly shows that smartphones make us dumb actually doesn't show that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the one way to think about it is that what we are arguing is that no one's proven yet that smartphones make us dumb, right?
Right.
But the flip side of that is, smartphones are terrible for lots of other reasons, right? They're good for some reasons, but they also are pernicious. Think about, how much time a 13-year-old now spends on social media, right? And
Yeah.
that's really damaging.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, technological change is always going to be there. And humans so far have been quite good at adapting to it. It changes the way we have to do things, and we change to do them that way. Sometimes the better, sometimes not.
Right. But it used to be the same thing, right? Like at some point, 13 years old used to smoke a lot and drink a lot. I mean, 13 years old are not drinking and smoking to that extent now. So it has
Oh, they
always
are.
been the part of existence, right? They are.
So 13-year-olds now are vaping.
Okay, yeah, they're vaping. Yes.
Because it tastes like cotton candy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, but I agree that there are things that, like, for one thing is, like, young people are having less sex than they did when I was young.
Yeah.
Right? And I think I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but it is certainly a feature of spending so much time staring at a little screen.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I mean, everything is delayed. Marriage, dating, everything is delayed and in a very unhealthy fashion.
Yeah. That's it. I mean, I don't, I have teenagers or a young adult children, and I feel like they're growing up really differently from the way I did, and I don't know what their future is going to be like. My daughter, who's 22, was freaked out when she's like, wait, if I were you, Mom, I would have met Dad this year. Right? The person I marry, I would have met this year. So I think, yeah, things are, and there's some good in that, I think, but that people are having more life before, especially women are having more life before they have children, which is always, no matter how much you try, disproportionately affects the activities of women.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely some good in this kind of like having a life before you have a family, and that life getting longer, it's hard to complain about.
Right. So that brings me to one of the most, I was seeking your views on something a little controversial, and you have some really elegantly written piece. Again, I discussed on this topic with Vicente on a universal principle about cognition and everything, thinking and the brain, the free energy principle. What do you think of the free energy principle, or any attempt to come up with a principle which can explain everything cognition?
Well, there's a paper I wrote with Mike Anderson where we argue against the idea that Friston and Andy Clark and other people have said, like, this is like a grand unifying theory of the brain. Even like, I think that brains are really, really complicated things, and right now, and maybe not on the horizon, is there a theory that will explain what our brains do, full stop.
Yeah.
Right. So and every time you have a theory that purports to do that, it always oversimplifies everything.
Yeah.
Now, all that said, I think that the free energy principle is interesting. I think that it's, a way to account for some things.
At least in theory.
At least in theory.
I as a analytical person, I see a lot of kind of simplifying and blatantly arbitrary assumptions which are just intractable throughout the process.
Right. I mean, I think that one of the things that happens with this kind of subset of cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, is that as soon as someone points out, a way in which the theory doesn't explain what they do, they just glom another piece onto it.
Yes.
Right? So, there's a category theory version of the free energy principle. So I think, it's changing really fast, and it's changing in response to criticisms, but you're right, it's changing in a way that's often seems arbitrary from the outside. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? Mathematicians know how to do things. And when they
but
see a hole that needs filling, they know the thing to put in that hole.
But do you really consider it as a piece of mathematical genius? I mean, given that, uh, does it belong to abstract mathematics, or has anything to do with neuroscience? Because is there any a single demonstration of it in actually working with the real physiological data? Like I'm not aware of yet, despite 20 years of development and about hundreds of thousands of citations,
Yeah,
as an enterprise.
that's a point that we make in that paper that with Vicente and Ed Baggs and Mike Anderson and a person who I've never met, so whose name I can't recall. I apologize, unknown person. But we just point out, like, it's pretty thin on the ground.
Yeah.
And even Andy Clark, who's one of the main proponents of this view, co-authored a paper about 2 years ago where he says, oh yeah, there's really no evidence that this is how brains work. And when they point to phenomena, they point to things that binocular rivalry. How often does that happen to an actual human, right? Other than when they're like lying down with cameras or video projectors projecting different things to each eye. That doesn't happen in real life.
No.
And maybe they have an account of that, but what do we need an account of that for?
Right.
No, it's not mathematical genius, because it's pretty standard mathematics. There's nothing, nothing revolutionary about it as mathematics.
Yeah.
It's a very general account of how systems that are, as I said this earlier, far from equilibrium systems might behave. Has it actually been applied in any detail to any real phenomenon? Not that I know of.
Yeah.
But I assume people are trying, and we just don't see it because they don't succeed, I guess, right? Because there aren't publications saying, here's a principle and here's how I confirm that prediction, or here's an actual neural system that behaves in a way that confirms in some way that what it's doing is minimizing free energy.
Right.
And the problem with, and this is another point that Mike and I made, is that in all of the talk about this, there are terms that have a mathematical meaning,
yes,
but also have a common sense or psychological meaning. And the proponents of the theory just switch back and forth between what the words mean.
Right. I think based on whatever is convenient and at whatever point, to get the arguments across the board.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so one of the great things about the free energy principle, people, is that Carl Friston is very open-minded and very interested in talking to philosophers about this. But so he's been very kind to me in person over the years, but one of the things he says often is, so okay, I understand that, but does it change the math? Right. So he's interested in talking to philosophers, but only if that will make him, change the formalization of the theory.
Yeah.
And it doesn't.
Right. And I personally amused, how can a person, of a intellect like him can actually believe in something like that? But I mean, as we discussed, science is religious in some ways. So
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. It's, I don't know how the man does what he does and gets sleep, for example. I mean, he publishes more articles in a year than I publish in my career. Right. So the mind there, the genius there is obvious. But yeah, I agree. The theory isn't as good as but Friston has a whole career before this of really deep and interesting neuroscience, neuroimaging work, and formal theories that are useful in neuroimaging and statistics.
Right.
So I mean, suppose the free energy principle, as I kind of believe, turns out to just be bullshit.
Yeah.
That's just one of the many great things that.
Right. What I found is amusing was that I was part of this group, And I know a lot of people who are mathematically illiterate and they can't understand an equation, but they were like ready to cite and explain everything based on free energy principle and just have some kind of equation as a shorthand for like everything they were referring to. So I was a little amused like how we in science in general we kind of amplify things which you don't understand a lot of times, giving a impression that when we publish paper we understand what we are saying, and perhaps not always.
Right. I think
Yeah.
Right now in philosophy and cognitive science, free energy is playing the same role that mirror neurons played a decade ago. They account for everything.
They account for everything.
Yeah.
And in fact, Gregory Hickok has a really awesome book called The Myth of Mirror Neurons, which reconstructs mirror neurons starting from the first article, saying the word itself.
Yeah. I have to admit that I have not read that. I own it, but I haven't read that book yet. But I mean, I remember, Pim Haselager, who's a Dutch cognitive scientist, was one of the authors on a paper in about 2009 or 10, saying, when will they stop calling them mirror neurons? That was the title of it. Because these neural systems seem to play a role in actually almost everything.
Right.
So specifically mirroring is probably not what they're doing.
Right.
And I think people have come to accept that now. At least the people I talk to have come to accept that now.
Right.
But yeah, so philosophers of cognitive science love their little, magic wands that they can wave. And FEP is one of them now. Predictive processing is one now. Used to be mirror neurons used to be one.
And what do you think of the ideas like allostasis or interoception, for which, again, we do not have almost any evidence except interpretations and terminologies?
Yeah, I mean, so, right. A lot of the work that people think is good in the predictive processing literature is about interoception.
Yeah.
Right. And I have to admit that before people started, getting a lot of attention, if we're talking about Emil Seth, Micah Allen, if we're talking about interoception in terms of this theory, I hadn't really thought very much about interoception, to be honest.
Yeah.
But, as you said, it's just a matter of interpreting things. There's no one said, okay, here's my scientific research program on interoception as a matter of minimizing free energy, and what experiments I'm going to do are A, B, C, D, E, and F. The results I'm expecting are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That hasn't happened yet, right?
Yes.
And maybe, again, Micah Allen is a neuroscientist, Anil Seth is a neuroscientist, but so far I feel like they haven't kind of paid up on the promises they've made here.
Right. So a lot of scientific debt. So let's talk about that. In an inflationary economy of science, let's talk a little bit of Popper. Okay. So I was fortunate to have debates with a couple of proponents of FEP, and I was shut down because I did not have enough citations and followers on Twitter at that time to be able to speak about science. But at the same time, the argument was that so I'm a little Popperian. I would say I'm staunch Popperian in my scientific practice. But I was told that there are alternate ways to do science and model building which are not Popperian, and we should in fact get away from Popperian falsification, because that somehow prevents us from exploring a lot of uncharted territories. Where do you stand as both as a practicing scientist and a philosopher on the Popperian way to do science and the role of falsifiability in science, given that strong inference was how I was taught science when I began my scientific career?
Well, I think Popper is the philosopher of science that scientists like. Philosophers of science don't like Popper by and large, mostly because he has a kind of a pretty rationalist view of the world. But also, I mean, falsification is too simple, I think, right? So if you do an experiment and make a prediction that turns out not to be correct, there are literally millions of things that could have made that happen that have nothing to do with the falseness of your hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea that, oh, my experiment didn't work, I'm going to change the theory, I believe. That's just not a way that practicing scientists typically work, right? Because it could be that you had a smudge on the glassware, or it could be, there are all kinds of ways in which things can go wrong that have nothing to do with your hypothesis being true or false.
But isn't there, that's where the grit of the science or experience comes in to weigh on and figure out whether it was something else or it might be the theory.
Right. I mean, that's what happens. Like, your experiment doesn't work. You don't suddenly say, oh, I'm a computationalist now. Right. What you do instead is you try to figure out if something went wrong and what went wrong. And you do another experiment and you do another experiment. And probably, given the relative brittleness of human minds as they age, probably you won't decide to believe a different theory because you spent all of your time learning the great complicated details of FEP. That's hard, right? So, what happens is like a bunch of people failing to get the kind of results that they want. The kind of predictive results is what leads to scientific change, not an individual case.
Right.
Right. The idea of a crucial experiment is very, very rare. And, so you're familiar with this, of course, the kind of debate that came up between Van Orden, Holden, and Turvey and E.J. Wagenmakers and his colleagues about what does 1 over F scaling mean?
Yeah.
Right, 7 or 8 years ago, I guess, 2015, there was published essentially a critical experiment.
Yep.
The results would turn out one way if it were mere additive noise, as Wagenmakers and colleagues say. It would turn out another way if it was because it was excuse me, an interaction dominant system, as Van Orden, Holden, and Turvey said.
Yeah.
So this experiment happened. Van Orden, Holden, and Turvey's view turned out to be the one that matched the predictions. It didn't change anybody's mind, though.
Yeah. Wagenmakers are still on the fence, on the other side, and yeah, you're right.
But, and arguably, it shouldn't change anyone's mind, right? Because it's one experiment, and something could have gone wrong. Something that that experiment might not have shown that the additive white noise understanding of the presence of pink noise in gross behavior,
right?
That may actually be what it is. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that falsification in individual cases never does, and almost certainly shouldn't, change scientific practice.
But in the formulation of your theory or the formulation of hypothesis, should the formulation be falsifiable or not? Yes, you might not, act based on falsification given these, a number of contextual factors, but should that be part of how you design your science or how you formulate a hypothesis and theories?
So Peter Godfrey Smith is a philosopher of science who has a book called Theory and Reality, which has basically become the kind of standard intro philosophy of science textbook in the last decade or so. He talks about how falsificationism doesn't actually work as a theory of how science works. But what he says is that, yeah, sure, okay, strictly speaking, it doesn't work. But a scientific theory, is the way he puts it, is that it has to stick its neck out, right? Mm-hmm. That is, there has to be some set of things that happen that could make you change your mind.
Right.
And, in practice, maybe not many people do, but you see people who like, oh, I can't believe you say, I've heard you, sorry, I haven't heard you, but I assume you've thought this of people like, wow, how could he still believe that after all of the results that have come in?
Right.
Right. So not everyone change, you can see that people should change their mind maybe, and people definitely should change their mind in certain cases, but that doesn't mean that they do.
Right.
Right. And again, I'm teaching Thomas Kuhn this week. What happens eventually is that, that guy that believes the theory that no one believes anymore because it hasn't made predictions that have turned out to be correct, he doesn't get funding anymore. And
Right.
the best grad students don't want to go work with him.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think the problem with falsification as a criteria for something being science is that scientists don't follow it.
Yeah.
Right. Not that, of course, if you believe something and you believe it as a scientific theory, there ought to be a set of circumstances that would make you not believe it anymore.
Right. Right. And
Right.
there
So
are other sociological factors which can take care of these, kind of impose some kind of an expiry date on these theories, right? Or
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I guess here's the way to say you can say what I've been trying to say in like a sentence, which is, falsification isn't a problem at all. Falsification-ism is a problem, right? And actually think that any ism in science is usually going to be a problem, right? That is so like, if I say, I could say to you, look, I do dynamical systems research in psychology. I would never say that I'm a dynamicist.
Right. Right.
Right. And I think that people say that they're computationalists.
Yeah.
It's equally a problem.
I see. So then, I mean, I understand the message, keeping an open mind in general. But how do you make sure that the mind is not so open that the brain falls out? Where do we draw the boundary?
Well, I don't know. I mean, frankly, the idea of open-mindedness is an aspiration that not many people live up to, frankly. So what could happen that would make me think that, oh yeah, like even reaching for a coffee cup requires detailed computational activity. There have to be things that could happen that would make me change my mind, or I wouldn't be a cognitive scientist. What those are, I don't know.
Right.
I mean, there have been more and more attempts to use AI to kind of decode neural signals.
Yeah.
Now, does that prove that neural signals are themselves a code? I don't think so. But if more and more things become decodable in the way using AI, you have to start to wonder, like, okay, maybe there is something to this idea that what brain activity is actually a kind of code that stands for something.
Right.
And the way I tend to think about brain activity is it's a biological thing. Right. It's a biological thing that kind of keeps us connected to the environment.
Right.
The way that we need to be.
Right. So, we're almost reaching the end of the podcast. What are some of your recommendations for somebody starting the career in cognitive sciences?
So one thing, that I was joking earlier about, like, your capital C career and capital S science. That's, if you want to, work at a med school and do science for more money than I make, and have an easier path to grants, you should do whatever seems to be popular at the time when you're in grad school. But the thing about grad school, you went through it much more recently than I did, is grad school sucks. Grad school is hard. And you're going to want to quit many, many times in the course of getting a PhD. So it's very difficult to convince yourself to keep doing something that you don't really believe in and care about. Right. So don't think you're going to get a PhD in the thing that you think will make you rich, because you won't finish, because getting a PhD sucks. Right. You won't finish. So, as much as you might think, okay, I'm going to believe the popular lucrative thing and work on that, it's the demands on you make it so that that's a very unlikely way to succeed. So only try to become a scientist if there's something that you really, really care about, because otherwise you won't succeed. And the fact is, you won't have to spend your prime of your life, your 20s, living in a shitty place, making no money if you don't become a scientist. Right?
Right.
So you should do the things that you care about more than anything.
Right.
Yeah, you got to want to do it.
Right. No, that makes complete sense. Testament. My career is also testament to the same advice. So Tony, any good book recommendations? I see a lot of books behind you. Some books do you recommend readers?
Yeah, so one book I always recommend is Mike Anderson's After Phrenology. It's just a great book. And what it does is it kind of puts the kind of views that I've been talking about ad nauseum now into a kind of neuroscientific context. And I think it's interesting in that. I have two books on the shelf I'm going to pull out and show you them. So here are two that I'm reading now, which I think are going to change what I do going forward, both of them. There's this one by a person whose name I don't really know how to pronounce, but it's about
Paula Silva, her essay for my affordances book is basically revolved around this book.
Yeah, I learned about it from Paula Silva.
Yeah.
And it's really an amazing book.
Right.
It's about how, basically people with disabilities create affordances for themselves.
Yeah.
And then there's this book by Alexis de Anda, whose name I do know how to say.
The Varieties of Experiences.
Yeah, so it's a reinterpretation of some ideas from William James so that they make more sense in the 21st century than people thought earlier. I'm a big fan of William James, but I always have always had a hard time arguing with people who explain all the ways in which his idea of experience doesn't fit with modern philosophical and scientific thinking. And Alexis in this book does a really good job of explaining how it does.
Yeah, your reading list seems to be very similar to Louis Barrett's, who I had the opportunity to talk to recently. And she also mentioned that you were planning to write a book together.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we actually do that. I mean, what I told her, I saw her this past summer, and we talked about how what I need to do is submit this book I'm working on now that I've been working on for 5 years, and then we can talk about it. And I submitted it a month ago. So my next thing I need to do is contact Louise to talk about what we're going to do. Yeah, I mean, it would, because we both wrote these books that came out at about the same time that said about the same thing.
Yeah.
And they're now more than a decade old, so we should update them. And I think it would be fun to do it together. That's the plan. Right. She put it during our meeting that she wants us to be the Donnie and Marie of embodied cognitive science. And you're much too young to know who Donnie and Marie are, but old people like me will think that's funny.
She told me the same thing.
Did she?
Yes, she mentioned on the podcast, the same Donnie and Marie, and asking me, I think you are too young to know, but here were they. Yes. So,
I hope you've looked it up.
In fact, I did not. I will today. So Tony, one last question before you leave. Since you wrote that book in 2009, how have you seen the book influencing people, especially youngsters, and cognitive science in general, taking this perspective more seriously?
So actually, that's let me take this opportunity to give another piece of advice for someone who's not beginning their career as a scientist, but someone who is in the kind of early stages of their career as a scientist. Because I wrote that book specifically so that grad students would be able to read it and enjoy it and make sense of it, right? And I think you're not going to do well at having an influence if you aim your work at established older people, because they already have the things that they do. So I really did aim specifically at grad students in the cognitive sciences. So I think that's and I think that's the reason that the book has had some uptake. You know, I think that probably when you get to the now, I'm a full professor, the people who are currently full professors, did I change anyone's mind who's that age? No. But I think I did get some people who weren't fully formed yet looking in the direction of the ecological approach and nonlinear dynamical modeling and robotics. And I think that to the extent that the book accomplished anything, I think that's what it did. Some subset of now 30 somethings are looking in this direction.
Yeah. Did you happen by chance to read Robert Trivers' The Theory of Self-Deception?
No.
So Robert Trivers, who's an evolutionary biologist, and people call him the living Darwin, he has a book called he has a theory called The Theory of Self-Deception, and his book is The Folly of Fools. And he talks about that how self-deceiving is an evolutionary adaptable trait, and it helps. So, for example, if your partner is cheating, you would like to believe that she or he is not, right? Until some extent. So there's some kind of a disbelief about certain things, which can influence your general stability. And I think there's a lot of self-deception, and you get better at it once you proceed in your career and you attain tenure, right? So then even if you have the disbelief, it does not make sense and it's not adaptable, and we have very little, room for, for example, how many of us would actually like to go and say that, the experiment I did was wrong or I made a mistake, if it is much more acceptable in science in general, compared to what it is currently.
Right. So, Louise studied with Trivers. But I think that there's something to that. And this is what I was suggesting earlier, how so many people finish their careers with the preponderance of evidence being that they were wrong, but not believing that they were wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe Trivers is right that there's something adaptive about that. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think that's the thing probably that explains best why scientists don't change their minds very often. Now, I'm worried now that you're saying that I'm deceived that I've had any influence on any grad students. I do think that there are lots of things in that book that I wish I had done differently, but
yeah.
It's a time capsule at this point. It's old, and it has had some impact at least.
No, it has had great impact. At least I can tell, from my perspective. Dora introduced me to this book when I was doing my PhD with her in I think 2016. And it was profoundly, I didn't understand a lot of it then, but definitely I've read it multiple times.
Well, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for volunteering for the show. And it was really a wonderful conversation.
It was good to talk to you. Good to meet you. I've been reading your work for a while, so it's good to see the person who's doing the work.
Definitely. Thanks, Tony. Have a great day ahead.
You too. Bye.
Bye.